But I do find network access to be a very easy thing to configure, probably easier than portal resources, RDP resources, definitely easier than app tunnel resources. Pretty straightforward. So let's review what we're doing here. We're going to apply the network access policy to APM. User will make their initial connection, and they can do this a couple of different ways. They can do it via a web browser. It's one of the reasons why SSL VPNs are so popular, is because it can be 100% clientless, meaning all I need is a web browser. So we can do that. We also have our version of a client, which is the Edge client. You've probably all used this already as an F5 employee to connect to our VPN. Either one of those will work, hopefully. We will still do all of our authentication, authorization, and endpoint checks. And then that is when if we're doing clientless, if we're doing web browser based, that's when an agent will need to run on the client. And the agent is responsible for creating that secure tunnel with APM. This agent may or may not work with every browser. The reason I have you do all of your exercises in Internet Explorer is because I haven't been able to get the agents to install properly using Firefox or using Chrome. Pull my hair out because I don't know. So we'll just use Internet Explorer for now. And so the flip side for our customers, fine, they can use the Edge client. Still works. In fact, I think more often customers that are going to be using this for their full VPN would typically probably want to use the Edge client with their employees anyway. But once they've got their secure tunnel in place, then they have access to all those internal resources as though they were connected locally within the office. As a reminder though, that doesn't necessarily mean we can log into everything. What I like to say is we can ping it, we can knock at the door, we just can't always enter, depends on if we are allowed to enter. So a couple things we have to configure, but not much. The first, I told you earlier, is that our network tunnel clients get an IP address assigned. So we create what's called an IP address lease pool, which is just a collection of IP addresses. It's a static list of IP addresses. It's not going to dynamically acquire those IP addresses from another source. That's the bad news. The good news is this can be any range of IP addresses. We can use any private IP address range as long as we have that configured on the BIG-IP for routing purposes. It's totally doable. So as soon as clients connect, they're going to get the IP address assigned to them. As I said, every client that connects is going to need an IP address. So we want to take that into consideration when we're building this lease pool, that we have enough IP addresses, and we also want to make sure that we don't have any duplicated IP addresses issued by DHCP or something like that in our network. But as you saw in that last call out, we can have both V4 and V6 lease pools. So we're going to set this up in the configuration utility. Also, if you're going to use the wizard, which is what you're going to use, the wizard will do this for us. But we can go in and create our own lease pool. And you can have several lease pools for different policies. In fact, you probably would have several lease pools for several policies. And as you see here, in addition to the name, I just have all the IP addresses and IP address ranges that I want. I can include as many as I want in there. That's all there is to a lease pool. Pretty simple. And then the second thing that we're going to set up, and there's only two, lease pool, and then the actual resource itself, like the portal resource or the RDP resource, we need the network access resource. Now don't be fooled, there's the path of how we get there. Don't be fooled by this screen. It looks like it's a real simple configuration of just a couple of items. But once I give it a name and I click on Finish, I'm going to get some more details to fill in. You'll notice we still have a caption here and an image. That's really only going to be important if you're going to be making this available on a web top. Remember earlier I mentioned there was a network access web top, and I said that if you're going to be using Edge client and all they're going to get is network access, I can use a network access web top, much easier for the user, and then they will never see this caption. There won't be any icons for them to click and open up. So as soon as I click on finished here, there's what I'm saying, then you'll see across the top I'm going to get a lot of other configuration options. But these are all optional. There's only one thing I have to configure here. Oh, I am going to use the whiteboard. All right, I'll do that in a second. And the whiteboard will deal with that first tab, the network options, network settings, close network settings. The main one, the one thing you have to configure is the lease pool that we're using. And that's actually all you have to configure. Everything else you could leave and it will probably work. But here are some of the other things we can configure. We can configure compression so that all the traffic between the client and the APM is going to be compressed, just like our HTTP compression that we have with virtual servers. And then we have our tunneling options. We have the full tunnel and a split tunnel. How many are familiar with that? Full tunnel, split tunnel? Now I'll pull this in here, because I just like to review for others that aren't as familiar with it. So I have the BIG-IP with APM, and we have a couple of networks here. We have a 10.1.10 network, and then we have a 10.1.20 network, we'll say. So when we do split tunneling versus full tunnel, on a client computer, what does that actually affect? What does that do, or what does that change on my client computer? The what? The routing. It changes routing. So this is how that works. So let's say I have a user, and they've got their wireless adapter, and right now they have an IP address of 128.10.11.12, just say for the sake of argument. As soon as they establish their tunnel, they're going to get an IP address assigned to them. So let's say they get an IP address of 10.1.50.1. And that is going to be for a PPP adapter. So if we're going to use a full tunnel, a full network tunnel, that will, as you just said, it'll change the routing table when they make their connection. And we're going to have an entry in the routing table for 0.0.0.0 pointing to 10.1.50.1. What does that mean? Everything's going to be forced through the tunnel to APM, to BIG-IP. So now, all of our remote users, all their traffic has to come through us, whether they're going to our internal resources, if they're going to Google. It does not matter. Now there's pluses and minuses here. The pluses, obviously, we have more control, we can see things, do things. We can also add the secure web gateway here, because this provides a couple of additional benefits. It lets us control the kind of websites they're going to, and it also will could identify if they're trying to access malware. So now we can stop that for our home users, which is great. What's a drawback to doing it this way? We're going to use up a lot of latency and bandwidth. Yeah, all this across the traffic, and then a poor BIG-IP is going to have to handle all that. So our other option is to do split tunneling. With split tunneling, I'm going to define these networks as part of the resource. So now what will happen is when we make our connection, we'll still have our entry for the 0.0.0, which will now point to 128.10.11.12, and then I'll have an entry for 10.1.10.0 going to 10.1.50.1. So now everything still goes out their wireless adapter like normal. Unless they're going to something in this range, they'll go through the PPP adapter, and then there'll be another entry for 10.1.20.0 going the same way. So that's sort of what the difference of those two are, and we can configure that in the on this page here. So full tunnel is real simple, just leave that selected, but if we choose to use the split tunnel, as I said, we have to configure those couple of networks that we have, and we'll do that right in there. So I've got my 10.1.20.0, my 10.1.30.0, and that's pretty much all we need to do. There's a couple other options down here, but I'm not going to go over them. That's the real meat of the Network Settings tab. Make sure you update. This is something we forget to do sometimes because you think you can go from tab to tab to tab, but each tab is saved individually, so we want to update that. We can also do a few other things here in the resource. One of them is we can optimize traffic to certain servers. Remember we talked about the app tunnel? In the app tunnel we define hosts and ports needed, and we could apply compression specifically to those hosts and ports. That's exactly what this is. We can define specific hosts and apply compression to just those. So instead of doing global compression for the whole tunnel, we can pick and choose the kinds of compression we want with different servers. So what I'm going to do is add entries here in my optimized apps list. So I'll put in host, port, types of compression that I want to enable. Pretty simple. Not too exciting, actually. Then we have our DNS tab. Here you're going to put kinds of things that would normally go configured on the client in IP addressing. So like a host name file, DNS settings, and so forth. Your Win server, your DNS server, DNS information, and then down here is kind of cool. Here you can actually create a pseudo host file for the client so that this isn't even a real URL. This is not listed anywhere in any of my DNS systems, but as soon as they connect, they could go to that URL and it'll bring them to that website, that IP address. And then as soon as they disconnect, those host names are gone. And then we have the drive mappings. So if you are familiar with the concept of the UNC path, Universal Naming Convention, where you will do the / with the server name, / shared folder name. And you can map that to a drive letter for the users. That's what we're talking about here. So I've got my shared folder name at the top. And by the way, it's important to note that APM doesn't verify that that's a real path. What's going to happen is if it's not a real path, when the user tries to access it, it's going to get a dead. So we can do that for our users. And then finally, we can have applications that automatically launch. And by the way, the last feature is just for Windows users, the drive mapping, no Mac users. This feature is for all users. So I can have an application automatically launch as soon as the tunnel is established. So earlier we were talking about having a custom client app that lets us do time card entries, and I want them to enter their time card as soon as they connect their tunnel. So I could put in the custom app there, my corp app.exe. So now as soon as their tunnel is established, this app will pop open on their screen, make life a little easier for them. This could be tricky because not all applications, an application is not always installed in the same location on every client device. And it would have to be in this case, with the only exception being that we do have some variables we can use for things like the window or the program files folder. So those are all the settings for a network resource. Again, the only one that really has to be configured is the pool, the lease pool. So once I've created that, I then add it to my policy like you did with all your other stuff, and you're good to go. And you'll do that in your exercise. Actually, you're going to go through all that in the wizard. So you're going to set all that up in a lot less time than I just took to explain it. Now let's talk a little bit more about kind of what I had on the board there, where we're talking about these different networks we have available, what APM is touching. So we have that 10.1.10 network where all my servers are. And then I have the 10.1.20 network where a bunch of my clients are, and then 10.1.20.30 network where I've got more clients. All my contractors reside there, we'll say. So I have a user who's just established their network tunnel. At this point, which of these resources do you think that user could access, could touch, could knock on the door? What was that?
All of them.
Well, let's see. All of them. Correct. Because APM, the network resource, does not control what they can access. It just says, great, you've established a tunnel, you can now come through me to anything available. So anything APM can touch is fair game to a network resource. And we may not care because I know that they can't access anything they couldn't access when they were in the network to begin with. But maybe I want more control. Maybe I'm a control freak and I just want to be able to control a little bit more. And we can do that. We're going to do that with what's called an access control list. So to start off with, to review, the network resource does not do access control. It only provides the tunnel. That's it. And that's what it looks like in your VPE on the advanced resource assign once you've got the network resource assigned. What we need, as I just said, is an access control list with access control entries, which looks identical to your AFM rules that we did last week. So I'm going to create an access control list. This is going to be for my employees. I'm going to let my administrators have full control of the network, but my employees are going to be locked down a little bit. So once I've got the ACL, I'll create it, and then I have the opportunity down here to add some entries. So for each one of these entries, just like AFM, I'm going to put either an IP address or a network address and an action, allow, reject, so forth. You will notice there's two different kinds of ACLs. There's the L4, the L7 and the L4. You're never going to use an L7. I'm just here to tell you that right now, but I'll explain it in a moment. L4 ACLs are for network resources. L7 are for portal resources. So the idea here is I could have a portal resource for www.lorax.com. And then I could create ACLs that say, you can access this page and so forth, and I can't imagine going to that trouble. But it could be done. So I'm going to just look at the L4. So the L4, like I said, just like a AFM rule, you got source information, destination information. Just FYI, we cannot use geolocation regions here like we can with AFM. Also important to remember is that this is actually a really important thing to recognize, to understand. People ask what happens if AFM and APM, a tunnel, are together. So client makes their connection to APM. AFM comes into play. They have to pass through AFM first, going to a virtual server that exists, all the things we covered last week about AFM. But now they've got through AFM, they've established a tunnel. Now they have the tunnel, they're not being checked by AFM for every request. They're going securely through the tunnel. The only checks made now would be here. But I already know their IP address. I've already established their IP address from the AFM rule. So I'm not necessarily concerned about that. I'm really more concerned about where they're going. So I'm going to allow them to go to the 10.1.20 network on all ports. I'm going to allow that. I'm also going to allow access to the 10.1.30 network. And I'm also going to allow access to a couple of servers in the 10.1.10 network. And then we do have to add the final line ourselves. It's not implicitly added for rejecting everything else. This is very easy to add here. So I created the ACL, pretty easy to create. Anyone have any guess where I'm going to apply that ACL? Just out of curiosity, any guesses? Which one? Let's see, advanced resource assign. Where would that be in there? Let's see. All right. So right now I have just network access for my employees, network access for my administrators. I only want to add this ACL to my employees. So let's see what happens if I add delete on the employees. And you may have noticed if you were looking around and observant that there is the first tab for ACLs. And I just need to select that, update it. Now I see that I've got a network resource with an ACL attached. That's all it takes. Bing, bam, boom, we're done. So now the way this will work, now, even though I've got this tunnel established, this nice secure tunnel, Now, every time I do something, if I'm going to try to access one of these, I will be allowed. Every time I try to access something, I'm going to be checked on that ACL. So I can get through to those. I can get through to those two servers, no problem. But when I try to access something on any other server, it's going to be blocked because I don't match one of those rules and I hit the reject. So it is like a secondary AFM. It's just unfortunately the things we can configure. AFM's easier to configure rules, we'll just say that. Wow, that was easy. I'm telling you, network resources I find to be much more straightforward, simple to create. If my customers wanted simple, I'd say let's do network resource. Let's see if we can do that. So last exercise for today, as I said, you don't need to have your previous stuff done because you're going to start from scratch with a new wizard, new virtual server. This one's going to be dedicated just for network access. You're going to use the Edge client. Then you're just going to make some modifications to what the wizard created for you, and then finally add an ACL.